There is one highest good, and for the Epicureans, this is pleasure.
Sounds like my type of philosophy.
Exactly. Don't get too excited though, because the Epicureans actually have a kind of austere and minimalist view of pleasure.
The triumph is one of the highest honors. You're hailed imperator by your troops, and you get to do a full day parade in Rome. Piso rejected his triumph. Tell us more about that.
Who wants to be a politician? I mean, it's just incredibly annoying, dangerous, heartbreak. Just don't do it. Withdraw, live a simple life. The Epicureans talk about the emptiness of glory and, all the troubles of political life and how it's not worth it.
So why on earth did part of the political elite adopt Epicureanism? I try to stay as far away from politics as humanly possible. I don't vote, I don't protest, I don't follow the news. All of it just seems so burdensome and unproductive. This is why Epicureanism comes so naturally to me, because one of its key doctrines is to withdraw from political life and tend to your own garden. The idea is to not get too caught up in worldly affairs and just build a small community of like-minded people. You can imagine my surprise then, when I learned of Epicureanism's popularity among the political elite in the late Roman Republic. And we aren't just talking about fringe senators who are pacifists or who are forced into political life. We're talking about people like Caesar, who many speculate was an Epicurean. We're talking about people like Cassius, who allegedly justified his assassination of Caesar on Epicureanism. How did a philosophy whose key doctrine is to abstain from politics become one of the dominant philosophies for politicians? This is the central question I discuss with a leading classicist, Katharina Volk. My hope is that by understanding why even Epicureans decided to enter the political world, I can see if I'm overlooking any reasons to engage in politics myself. My name is Jonathan B. I'm studying the great books and sharing their insights through lectures and interviews. If you want to join my journey and learn with me, please subscribe. Without further ado, Professor Katharina Volk. Let's begin with Epicureanism itself. What are its major doctrines?
Right. So Epicureanism is another Hellenistic philosophy. So it comes from the late 4th century in Athens. And like many other philosophies, including Stoicism, also has this idea that there is one highest good, the summum bonum, which is basically the key. So if you have that, you have made it, you have achieved happiness or eudaimonia. And for the Epicureans, this is pleasure.
Right. Sounds like my type of philosophy.
Exactly. Now, don't get too excited though, because the Epicureans actually have a kind of austere and minimalist view of pleasure. So while pleasure does include sort of things that people normally consider pleasures, especially pleasures that are perceived by the senses, the highest pleasure, according to Epicurus, is actually the absence of pain. So he talks about a state of absence of physical pain and mental disturbance, because mental disturbance is also a form of pain. So ideally, you want to be in this state where you have no physical pain and where you're not upset about anything.
And what are the other pleasures? Are they just the everyday pleasures we think of, in addition to pursuing the absence of pain?
This is actually a very good question, because it's not actually all that clear what would qualify as an Epicurean pleasure. But it's certainly things that I mentioned are things like food, drink, and sex. So you can be sure that those qualify. Other sort of sense perceptions, like beautiful sights and sounds, but it's getting very, very, unclear there. And scholars of Epicureanism are actually having a hard time with that. But the most important thing is really this sort of state where you're not in pain and where you're not upset by anything.
I see. Let's talk about the social dimension, or lack thereof, of Epicureanism. On one hand, it seems to emphasize friendship very highly, which of course is a social dimension. On the other hand, it counsels withdrawal from the community. So help us, tease out the social dimension here.
Right. There's a sort of an ideal of self-sufficiency, and this ideal that you can provide everything you need. So, for example, you can provide enough food to still hunger. You don't have to have fancy food. You don't have to have fancy drink. You don't have to have a fancy house. And frankly, you don't need a lot of all sorts of things. And if you get into the wrong mindset, you might get upset if you don't have them. Like, what if you feel like you can only have caviar and champagne? Then the day when you can't have caviar and champagne, you're going to get upset. So just understand that you don't need caviar and champagne. Similarly, you might, or fancy clothing, or a high-paying job, or political power. So there are all sorts of things that you don't need to achieve pleasure and hence happiness. And in fact, that are sort of a trap, because once you think you want them and you can't get them, then you get upset and then you start fretting about all these sorts of things. And so one of the things that you don't need and that you would just fret about is, political life. Who wants to be a politician? I mean, it's just incredibly annoying, dangerous, heartbreak. You're going to drive yourself crazy. Just don't do it. Withdraw, live a simple life. The Epicureans are also not very much into marriage and children because, what kind of, trouble all that is. And so what they like is to hang out with like-minded people in Epicurean communities, with their friends. Don't harm anybody, live a hidden life, live a simple life, talk about philosophy and be happy. I mean, ideally.
Right. So you really weren't kidding when you told me not to get too excited. Because,
exactly.
Because it seems it's more about restraint than it is about indulgence. Exactly. Because a key doctrine is that your expectations adjust.
Yes.
Right? And so the idea is almost like, well, let's take the bare essentials of what you need and let's satisfy that. And importantly, let's not make sure you desire anything more.
Exactly.
Right? One thing appears to be both key to the Epicureans' happiness as well as not self-sufficient, and that's friendship, right?
Right.
So how does that seems to be a deeply social part of the philosophy.
It's a big problem in the understanding of Epicureanism, because again, it's one of these things. So there's only one real good, right, which is pleasure,
right? And
so nothing else can be a good in and of itself.
It has to collapse to pleasure.
So everything else has to be instrumental for pleasure. So friendship is instrumental for pleasure, but then people
can
are
I pause you there? Is friendship instrumental to pleasure because it is a form of pleasure, or because it leads to other pleasures?
Because so that's a question. It's probably not a form of pleasure, though I guess the practice of friendship can sort of entail certain forms of pleasure. But then people feel, and already in antiquity, it is like if you treat your friends just purely instrumental, right? Like, what kind of friendship is that, right? I mean, doesn't friendship entail that you somehow appreciate the other person for who they are? So if you then praise friendship like this, as you do, as Epicurus does, are you actually undermining your own philosophy by more or less bringing in another good through the back door? Or is this really some sort of friendship that where you don't appreciate the other person in their own right? And so this is a huge problem, and there is no good solution for that.
I see. Well, let's talk about the part that it counsels withdrawal. And it seems like the answer, as it all boils down to, is pleasure, right? Like, don't engage in political life, because desire for glory and vanity, that's hard to get, and you're going to entangle yourself in all these different things. Now, obviously, the other philosophies like Stoicism and even more modern philosophies that counsel political engagement, citizenship, they don't say you should engage because out of your self-interest. They try to say you have a duty, right? That you have a responsibility to engage in the community. But Epicureanism does not see this type of duty for its practitioners. Is that right?
Yeah, and that's another problem, because basically the Epicureans are freeloaders, right? So the Epicureans like to have a sort of a nice, well-ordered society where they can just sort of live on the margins and do their thing. And I mean, they're not going to be troublesome. In fact, they will participate in events of their community, including religious ceremonies, even though the Epicureans believe the gods don't concern themselves with human beings, but they're not going to rock the boat, right? So because they just want to have a quiet life. But then the question really arises: what if everybody is now an Epicurean? I mean, then who's going to, who's going to make sure the roads are paved and all that? So it is problematic. They have a kind of emergency clause, which is like, okay, if there's a crisis, if it is necessary, the Epicurean will step up and will engage in politics, if it has to happen. And Cicero is very sarcastic about it and said, well, like how would people who have never done anything in politics and have no idea how it's done? So, and then there's a crisis, then suddenly the Epicurean comes and says, okay, folks.
We'll save the day.
Yeah, I'm going to save the day. I mean, like that's going to happen.
And this should all build up interest to the eventual group that we're going to investigate today, the politically engaged Epicureans. Right? How can you believe all these things that we discussed earnestly in many cases, and then engage in civil war and sometimes assassinations? But I want to stick on Epicureanism for a bit longer. My understanding is that these didn't remain as ideas, that the Epicureans had these actual communes around the Mediterranean and Europe for centuries, right? So tell us a bit about the sociology of Epicureanism in this age.
Yeah, they certainly did some philosophical training of, newcomers. And otherwise, I think they were just sort of living, pleasant lives out in the countryside. So in the other interview, you were mentioning, we're mentioning Piso, who was the father-in-law at some point of Julius Caesar, who had a villa not too far from Rome in the Bay of Naples area, where he seems to have, gathered around himself an Epicurean group under the leadership of a actually very significant Greek Epicurean philosopher at the time, Philodemus. Were they there all the time, or did they just go out there, on holidays? But yeah, there were certainly more than in all the other philosophies. There was a sort of very much a sort of group element, a social element.
And my understanding is that Epicureanism was one of the most popular schools of philosophy at the day, right? Why was it so appealing to the Romans at the time?
Yeah, I mean, like one argument would be like Cicero, who's very anti-Epicurean, would be like, well, because it's easy to understand and it's about pleasure, and then everybody thinks, yeah, this must be cool, and they're sort of, hedonists and they're attracted to this. I mean, another reason might really be political, disaffection among the upper classes, people who feel, things are going in the wrong way. Politics is not satisfying. It's
and
actually
they don't see an outcome, so they withdraw.
Members of the so-called equestrian class, so rich people who may be rich enough or may have the opportunity to enter into politics, and as Cicero did, but just decide not to do that. So Cicero's best friend Atticus was in that situation. He could have become a politician, but he decided not to. He was an Epicurean, so maybe that's a reason why. I mean, I'm not going to become enter politics in this, in this day and age. I'm not going to enter politics. I'm going to stay out of that.
Whenever a school of philosophy gets very popular, it usually seeks to justify itself to the state that it inhabits, right? But as we described, it seems very hard to justify Epicureanism because you're just these freeloaders who don't contribute anything to the community. It's not like you're producing art or something, right? And contributing that way. So how did the Epicureans justify themselves in a Roman system that is famous for its emphasis on civic virtue and participation?
This whole problem of the freeloaders, right? I mean, would only become a huge problem if the majority of the population became Epicureans, which was so unlikely at any time. So maybe people weren't really concerned about this in a practical way. I mean, it's a question. I mean, there are different possible answers. The one is that Epicureanism also developed over time, and that there is more a brand of Roman Epicureanism. Partly, maybe people just didn't care. I mean, like, think of something else.
Those fringe hippies, let them do at their communes what they want to do.
I mean, even the people who were Epicureans, that they didn't necessarily have this all, thought out to every single detail. I mean, like, think of other, philosophies or worldviews, like religion, like, say, Christianity. I mean, there could, today in American societies, there could be people on all sides of the political spectrum, or people who are not political, or not, very, very different ideas about society. And they could all call themselves Christians and somehow be convinced that they are really Christians and they're really representing. And I think, this could have been true for Epicureanism too. But then we do find a few people who do seem to actually justify political actions in an Epicurean way.
Right.
And that's very interesting.
Right. And we're going to talk about those people. But before we do that, what is the history of Epicureanism after this period? Because it seems like it's not a very active school today. So what happened to this tradition?
Yeah, I mean, there are Epicureans in antiquity, but you're right. I mean, it's not like Stoicism in the Roman Empire. It's a philosophy that has always had a lot of detractors because of the pleasure, because it has this atomistic physics, which of course doesn't go well with all sorts of other worldviews, like including
religion,
Christianity.
right.
Then the whole idea that the gods don't interact with human beings and don't care about human beings. So, once Christianity comes in, this is of course totally anathema. And is suppressed, but is really, in a way, coming up, lifting its head again and again. I mean, at various points in the early modern period, there was this successful book by Stephen Greenblatt called "The Swerve" about the rediscovery of Lucretius.
Right?
So a lot of modern natural philosophy, early modern and modern natural philosophy and physics, of course, was looking to atomism. Free thinking in the 18th century was using Epicureanism. So Epicureanism has had its various little moments of renaissance, during Western intellectual history. And while there isn't today a kind of modern Epicurean movement to rival the Stoics, which, as you were saying, are very popular, there is a little bit of that. I mean, there are Epicurean websites, so there are people who call themselves Epicureans,
That's
but it's not a mainstream thing.
But as you were just discussing that, a thought came to my mind, which is that in some sense, Epicureanism has secured total victory in the modern West, even if not explicitly under the Epicurean name, in the sense that what's the dominant philosophy today? Well, it's atomistic and materialist as its metaphysics. It emphasizes friends and pleasure. It's about living the good life now, right? It renounces a lot of these things like political engagement. So in some sense, we are all Epicureans, and it's the most successful movement, even more than Stoicism,
not so called, right?
Yeah, right.
And I guess the sort of minimalism that you have in, maybe that has fallen a little bit by the wayside.
What does that tell us about our age, that this sort of neo-Epicureanism, even if not under its own name, has become so popular? Might that reflect the same kind of disaffection with politics, engaging with the world, that caused Roman Epicureanism to be so popular?
Yeah, I think to some extent there are other developments. I mean, the demise, at least in some parts of the Western world, of religion, modern science. But certainly you could sort of see a kind of mass society where, even in a democracy, the individual doesn't have a lot of immediate political power, right? So it's very easy to,
tend to
step back and tend to your own garden. Exactly.
Right. Because foundationally, it's about participating and focusing on your private life.
Yeah.
That's what the philosophy is about, which sometimes might mean that public life has gone wrong in some way, right? And so it could be a potential worrying symptom that we should investigate. So that's Epicureanism. And now I want to see and investigate how these principles are actually lived out, right?
Right.
And let's begin with someone you brought up, Atticus, one of Cicero's friends, who didn't become a full sort of recluse. Otherwise, we wouldn't have anything on him. But he didn't engage in Roman politics in the way that Cicero, Caesar, Cato did. But it's fascinating that he was almost behind every significant event during this period. So tell us about the fascinating life of Atticus.
Right. So he was a member of this equestrian class. So he was very rich. He was a businessman. So he supported Cicero, but also lots of other friends. He was a moneylender, basically. He was extremely well educated. He got this nickname Atticus, meaning Attic, as in, Attica in Greece, because he lived in Athens for a while. And he was an Epicurean. And so, it is then then attractive, right, to wonder the fact that unlike his friend Cicero, who comes from a similar social class, Atticus did not decide to enter politics. Does that have to do with his Epicureanism or vice versa, right? That he really decided not to do that and live this more hidden life. And he was really a great person for friendship. So he was not just friends with Cicero, but with a lot of other important people at the time, including on different sides of the political spectrum, which in the end stood him in good stead. I mean, during the Civil War and the aftermath, because he would actually support both Brutus and the other assassins, but not officially,
right.
just behind the scenes, financially.
I see. Right.
I think, but he would also support the Mark Antony and his family when they were in trouble, and this worked out very nicely for him because unlike the other people who were killed
like
either
Cicero.
in battle or who were assassinated, he survived and got out of this. So he was very, very kind of cagey and careful.
Right, I see. Which would lend well for an Epicurean mode of analysis, right? That primarily guarding your private life and the sustenance of that is the primary thing.
Right.
So the example you mentioned was during the tumultuous period of the First Triumvirate and the eventual Civil War, as well as the assassination of Caesar. And Atticus, while living amongst high Roman society, survived all of this.
Right, exactly.
Because he made friends with everyone. And he helped them financially, he helped their wives, right, in doing all these different things. Surely that must have raised a few eyebrows. Wasn't this an issue in some way? Like, he's a good friend of Cicero. Yeah. Wouldn't Cicero say, why in the world are you helping the other side?
I think we don't have evidence a lot for the last year of Cicero's life, which is when this would have been going on, that it is possible that there was some kind of breakup or falling out. I mean, I think if Cicero really knew that Atticus was supporting Mark Antony, I don't think he would have been well pleased. I mean, maybe there was a sense, okay, these times are really bad, each man for his own, you do what you think you need to do. But I mean, I think there might have come the point where this was really going a step too far.
I see. And so is Atticus emblematic of a larger political class? I mean, we have this today. It seems to me the best position to be in America today to wield political power is not explicitly in office, but in the capitalist class, right? And being able to fund different sources. And this is what Atticus was. Is this emblematic of the larger relationship between the equestrian wealthy class and the political class, or is this just one anomaly?
I think a little bit, you could say that. But what people also say that this is also sort of like an early clue to the new direction, right? So because then under the emperors, right, you don't get any more senators who really wield any real power, as opposed to just administrators. But you still get a lot of rich equestrians who support, who are courtiers, who are give money, give advice, but don't hold office and don't have power. So I mean, for example, like who becomes Augustus's right-hand man? Maecenas, and that's exactly the kind of person. I mean, he was a sort of Atticus. I mean, he was also an equestrian. He was also incredibly rich. He was also very cultivated. This sort of, as it were, like rich power, class, but people who don't have any real power, but who are just the advisors and maybe the financiers.
Among the equestrian class, right, this wealthy, non-political class, Epicureanism, was it the most popular there, or was there the lower class Epicureans? There certainly was the Roman senatorial Epicureans, which we're going to explore later, which is the most fascinating because they're politically engaged. But is there also like a lower class?
We don't know. I mean, Cicero sometimes makes it sound this way. And in the past, people have accepted that as like, oh, this must have been so appealing to the lower classes. But I think now people are much more sort of skeptical about that,
Right.
because I mean the lower classes were illiterate, and
Right.
and so I think it's more Cicero saying, oh, this is like this sort of lower class stuff. Yeah, it does seem to be the case that there is a fair number of equestrians who are, I mean, fair number, we're still
Right,
talking
yeah.
very small numbers, who are Epicureans, and you could say
Yeah.
that maybe that would lend itself particular to this class. But then,
Right.
as you're saying, there are also some senators who
Right.
espouse Epicureanism.
So let's talk about that, because that is the most
Right.
fascinating group
Right.
of all, right?
Yes.
Because one of the key, not just a tangential doctrine, one of
Right.
the key doctrines of Epicureanism, it was withdrawal because of all of these negative externalities that engaging in political life sort of provides you. So why on earth did part of the political elite adopt Epicureanism?
Yeah. There are many possible explanations. I mean, the one is that they basically bought into part of it and not the other part. And
So they're not real Epicureans. That's
Yes.
one answer. Yeah.
and I mean, who is a real Epicurean? I mean, who is ever the real Stoic sage, right? I mean, I think just with religion, I mean, I think people will adopt some parts that appeal to them, and then they will just sort of like ignore the other parts. So I think that's certainly possible. Then there is the question, but I'm sort of agnostic about this, whether contemporary Epicureans, again, whose works either we don't have at all or we only have fragments, pushed a more sort of lenient view, especially those who had Roman patrons among the upper classes, right? Then is the question of, if you were a member of a family that was already senatorial, right? So not a new man like Cicero, but it was sort of your grandfather had been in the Senate, your father had been in the Senate. I mean, for you to say, hey folks, I'm now an Epicurean, I'm off to like some sort of hippie commune. I mean, that just was pretty much impossible. Now, finally though, and this is of course the thing I guess we would be most interested in, is I am being politically active as an Epicurean because this actually fits with my philosophy. So, I mean, you could argue this, emergency clause, we are in a civil war where the republic is in crisis, so I better, do something. Even Epicurus says, in a crisis you can do it. Or, we have that very interesting letter by Cassius, who is, Brutus and Cassius, one of the assassins of Caesar.
Right.
Cassius and Cicero are corresponding about another person who is a Caesarian, Pansa, who was also an Epicurean and who was behaving very well, even to the older, the ex-Pompeians, like Cicero. And Cicero says, well, this shows that this person is not a real Epicurean because he's clearly doing the right thing for its own sake, whereas the Epicureans could only pursue virtue for the sake of pleasure. And so clearly he's undermining his own Epicureanism, which is a typical argument that you do as a philosopher, that if you're doing this or if you're holding that view that, contradicts your other views, so therefore. And then Cassius says, no, I mean, he is acting as an Epicurean, and Epicurus actually says you cannot have pleasure without virtue, and that he is actually, because Pansa was being very conciliatory among these political factions, and that he's actually contributing to peace. So if you have some sort of argument that some politician could feel like, okay, so the Epicureans, what do they want? They want to have a politically stable, commonwealth to pursue their pursuit of pleasure. In some situations, you kind of have to step up to the plate and be the person who brings about this peaceful, And so is that something that Pansa was thinking, that, I'm actually contributing here to a situation that is ultimately going to be helpful, even to my own pleasure. And Epicureans were making these arguments, including about, this is some sort of infamous tale from early Roman history about the man who had his own son executed because he disobeyed military orders. And Cicero is like, yeah, clearly he wasn't doing this for pleasure. And then this Epicurean says, oh yeah, no, he was doing this for pleasure because he had to keep up the morale of the army and ultimately, the stable political situation from which his own well-being depended. So you can make a whole sort of argument that ultimately it all works towards ensuring pleasure.
Right. What I find so humorous about this is most philosophies, at least philosophy people want to advertise, sort of talk up their intentions. Right. Whereas Epicureanism seems to sort of debase oneself as much as possible in two senses. One is to say, no, I'm doing this purely selfishly. Right. It's not for the Republic. Right. The second thing is, no, I'm not doing this for honor. I'm doing this because I'm like a dog. Like I just want to eat and sleep and like have sex. So I find that incredibly humorous. And I just want to be clear here to clarify. By pleasure, the Epicureans aren't saying friendship is a form of pleasure. They're saying all these things can lead up to pleasure. Yeah. So in the case of the man killing his son, it's not like holding up a military honor as a pleasure in itself. No. It's that by maintaining military victory, I can eat dinner tonight, right? Something like that, right? Right. So it's really animalistic. Right. Like it boils down to really animalistic things, right? Well, that's incredible, yeah. Cassius, who you mentioned. Right. Is also, I think, an alleged Epicurean, right? And he even potentially justified the assassination of Caesar through Epicureanism. And this just shows you how far we are at from the raw ideas. Like, not only is he politically engaged, he's sort of actively planning an assassination on Epicureanism. So tell us about that, because I feel like if you can justify a political assassination, you can kind of justify anything.
I mean, again, we don't know. Unfortunately, we have that one letter of Cassius where he's talking about this other person, which is very interesting in terms of justifying political activity in an Epicurean way, but we don't have his justification for the assassination. But I mean, you could sort of argue, right, that the political situation at Rome has become untenable. It's very unstable. It is not conducive to the pursuit of pleasure. It's not peaceful. So we have to get rid of this person who is really the one thing that is,
I can't eat, sleep, drink, and have sex unless he dies.
Yeah, I mean, it's also the mental lack of disturbance that is the most important thing. So I can't be quiet. I can't be at peace. I cannot have a safe and peaceful life as long as this person here is.
Let's examine another alleged Epicurean who's also clearly not a pacifist or a recluse at all, and that's Caesar himself. Right. In this specific comment, Caesar says that he's lived enough for both nature and glory. What did he mean by that, and why is that an potentially Epicurean saying?
Caesar was getting kind of jaded towards the end of his life, and I wasn't exactly daring people to assassinate him, but was sort of like, put on this attitude and saying that I have lived enough. Now, okay, glory, that's really not very Epicurean at all. I mean, but lived enough for nature. I mean, the Epicureans have this, one of their main tenets is that you don't have to be afraid of death. And they think that it's actually fear of death that makes people do all sorts of bad things that are ultimately bad for themselves. But this also means sort of seeing that, your life will just run its course. And at some point, it's going to be enough. And you should have the attitude, so they have this image of a person who is at a party and at some point realizes, I've really got the best out of this party. I've had enough.
Let's call it quits,
Let's call it quits, while
we're ahead.
Exactly, while we're ahead. And I'm just going to leave. You leave like a satisfied party goer. And you leave voluntarily. It has been enough. And in fact, Lucretius, who is this Epicurean poet, has nature personified, tell the person who doesn't want to die that she's given him enough. And this is it. So this enoughness, and that you can just quit at any time without being upset. So that seems to be Epicurean, maybe.
Right. That's surely a consolation for someone who perhaps died early. Is that an active license for suicide?
Most of the time, not, but in certain situations, yes.
Right.
I mean, if
when there's so much pain
illness,
ahead, right?
if so much, absolutely. Especially since for the Epicureans, they don't seem to really feel that there's such a big difference between life and death. So you can just quit if it's no longer any good. And I mean, you could argue, I mean, this is very tentative, that, Caesar, of course, exposed himself to a lot of dangers in his life. I mean, he could have died any time. That maybe if you have a kind of philosophy that considers neither life that, valuable, nor death at all a horrible thing, that you might be able to do risky things more easily than if you think life is incredibly valuable and death is a disaster.
I see. Let's go back to the Epicurean reasons for political engagement. One thing that you mentioned in the book is an argument that's contingent and that says, look, if you desire glory so strongly, you might as well go and satisfy it. Because if you don't, that's going to cause a lot of mental disturbance. Yeah. So that could be another Epicurean way for why someone would want to engage in the political life.
There seems to be a little bit of evidence that Epicurus said something like this. This would be nearly like the Stoic persona theory, that there are individual cases.
Right.
Like if you are already born into this political class, you've always been told this is what you're going to do.
It's more trouble trying to leave.
It would be total trouble trying to leave. So just, and you've already been conditioned this way. So why not just do it?
Right, I see.
I mean, that's not a great philosophical argument, but I mean, in terms of an art of life, what am I to do? I mean, am I going to give up my family and move to a commune, or am I just going to live the life and just have a different attitude?
But it could be a philosophical argument in the sense that the hedonistic calculus might work out in favor of not destroying my relationships, but having to engage in politics versus getting the benefits of withdrawal, but leaving all my possessions and having to work hard labor or something like that, right? But ultimately, Epicureanism is quite suspicious of glory and the desire for ambition and power, right? And so surely its primary goal should be try to talk people out of it. Is that right?
Yeah, Epicurean writers do that and talk about the emptiness of glory and, all the troubles of political life and how it's not worth it.
And the example that I'm going to raise now, I think, is a fascinating exploration to see how deeply in tension this rejection of glory and worldly life is with traditional Roman values. So I believe Piso, is it? Was going to get a triumph in Rome. Now, my understanding is that a triumph is one of the highest honors, the most glorious thing. You're hailed imperator by your troops because of some great military victory, and you get to do a full day parade in Rome. Piso rejected his triumph. Tell us more about that.
I mean, we don't know why he actually rejected it, but Cicero, who is his adversary, is criticizing him as an Epicurean. But it could be argued, right, that Piso was a politician. He's the one who's the father-in-law of Caesar, and Cicero hates him because he's partly responsible for his exile. But he was actually quite a moderate. Piso was. And there's sort of various things in the career of Piso where you could sort of see maybe this is how an Epicurean would do politics. So he's doing his job, but he's then not going to go out of his way to get a triumph. Or later on, I think he rejects, or he's trying to reject an office, which the office of censor, which might just be too much work, or might be the sort of thing where you make a lot of enemies. And he is also very much tries to be a peacemaker in the run up to the Civil War, and afterwards too. So this could actually be a kind of model. You just avoid some of the more extreme things that were, too much effort, or would expose you to ill will, or, whatever.
What I found so fascinating is Cicero's critique of Piso.
Yeah.
So let me quote you, Cicero. "You have heard the words of the philosopher, Piso. He said he never had any desire for a triumph. You criminal, you plague, you stain."
Yes.
What I found so fascinating about this is, what is our common reaction to seeing someone reject sort of honors that they deserve. It's applause, right? It's praise that you sort of transcended in some way. But I think, and what's really fascinating, not in this quote, I think Cicero's critique is that he actually didn't desire glory enough, that he didn't have enough ambition or maybe concern for Roman values. And that's how deeply in tension Epicureanism and this classical set of Roman doctrine is, that the Romans are very suspicious of these people. Is that right?
Yeah. No, I think that's right. And I mean, there is a sort of sense there must be something wrong with someone who doesn't want that. So, I mean, it's not even just about Epicureanism. I mean, much later on, Tiberius, the emperor, tells the Senate he doesn't want to be worshipped as a god. And you would say, wow, that's really very enlightened, fantastic, super. And in reality, as Tacitus tells us, that then everybody thinks something must be wrong with Tiberius, and he doesn't want these honors that are becoming traditional. So something. A person like this, there's just something totally suspicious about him.
It's funny because I can't remember which saint it was. Maybe it was Aquinas, where I think he rejected women so much that his parents hired a prostitute or something to try to seduce him. And he was like, no, I will not. And I think his parents had a very similar sort of reaction, which is like, what is wrong with our son? Even though the desire in question, as is the case with ambition, is canonically a suspicious desire in itself. So you'd think renouncing it would be an indicator of holiness. And maybe that just shows how different our post-Christian world is with the Roman system, right? If you're a Roman and you don't desire triumph, what's wrong with you?
Exactly.
Like, are you, I don't know, like, is it a disrespect of the Roman order, right? That's the mode of questioning,
Exactly.
Right. So we talked about why Epicureans wanted to engage in the political order of Rome, which is a fascinating conversation. But let's step back a bit. Could you give us a survey of why the other schools or why popular strands of thought that a Roman should engage in political life?
Yeah, except for the Epicureans, all the other schools feel that social life and hence political life is natural for human beings, and then therefore it's sort of part of the highest calling of human beings to do that. And you know, if you want to exercise virtue, which again all of them want to do, even if they don't necessarily think it's the only good, like the Stoics do. I mean, what is a better place to do that than to do it in the political realm, right? Is if you are a man. And then, of course, this very easily meshes with traditional Roman views of, what is valuable and what people should be doing, and what kind of careers they should be following. So in that way, it's very easy to reconcile them, the way it's not with Epicureanism.
Right, I see. So the reason that Romans traditionally engage, is it out of self-interest that I can win money? Is it out of glory that I can win honor? Or is it out of duty? Or it's all of the above, I imagine,
It's all of the above. I mean, I think it's very often in societies, I mean, people don't question this. I mean, this is just something we do.
It's a given, right?
It's a given. And if you're a member of this family that has always been doing this is what we do. We run, this is our state. We run it. I mean, we are the ones who have the power.
It's not even a question that needs to be asked, right? So let me ask you this. The desire for glory, right, which I suspect is actually motivating most people's engagements with the Republic, especially at the upper levels, rather than a genuine altruism or desire to help. What is the canonical Roman view on it? Because on one hand, the person without the desire for glory is deeply suspect.
Exactly.
But clearly, people also critique Caesar for being too ambitious. So tell us about the Roman view to glory and how it gels or does not gel with the actual genuine desire to help the Republic.
You're right. So it's something that is very much accepted and expected in this society, but it's also a liability, right? I mean, if people only go for their personal glory. So I guess if people were actually formulating a theory of glory, they would have to sort of say that it has to really be ultimately to the glory of the Republic and not so much to the glory of the individual. And there were, all these sort of people already in the 2nd century BCE who were sort of seeing a dangerous move towards individuals and away from the the community. And Cicero actually, like one of the last works he writes is a work on glory, which unfortunately we don't have, but which seems to have been, like his work on friendship and also his work on duties, a kind of attempt to reinterpret traditional values in a more philosophical way, right? So that there's something, and you see Cicero talk about this in other works, that there is something that is true glory, and true glory is only for virtuous action, and this is only action that is in the interest of the res publica, not against it. So someone like Caesar, if he's acting against the res publica, that is not
vanity
true glory, right? So that doesn't even qualify as glory. And he does something similar with friendship. So friendship with bad people is not actually true friendship. And if your friend asks you to do something against the Republic, he's no longer your friend. So
that was the justification for killing Caesar, right?
Yes,
to show that these people didn't betray their friendship, because it wasn't friendship in the first place.
It wasn't friendship anymore. But of course, traditionally, it would have been very much been viewed as friendship and as a kind of betrayal of friendship.
Right, I see. So what I'm hearing on glory is to not desire glory at all is deeply suspect.
Yeah.
But to desire the wrong type of glory is also problematic.
Right.
And for Cicero, at least, what the right desire for glory is you can desire reputation and you can desire your name to last for eternity, but it has to be for virtuous deeds. And things like that.
I mean, ideally, glory, right, and reputation is also sort of a control, because it means that other people approve. Right. So if people don't approve what you do, then, you're probably doing something bad. Whereas if you're acclaimed by the Roman people and the Senate, right, then that probably means that you did something good.
I want to explore one last path of having my Epicurean cake, but eating it too, which is living in a withdrawn way, but contributing to the polis through scholarship, right? And you get the benefits of the Epicurean life because you're not bothered by all these political events, but you're also helping the polis through scholarship and through education. Was this ever considered a middle ground for Epicureans who wanted to engage?
I don't think so, because how does that help your pleasure? I mean, then you would have to argue that that's a pleasure in itself, which I would think is very reasonable, but doesn't really work with the Epicureans. I mean, all that they would do is that, they want to teach, but they want to teach other Epicureans, right?
See.
So in that sense, so it's not just about the politics, but it's just about engagement in general.
Right, but as we have seen, for example, when we talked about Cicero in the other interviews, that this was a strategy that people used, if not on Epicurean grounds, that I am withdrawn from political life, whether it's because I'm in exile or because I don't want to participate in it, but I still can contribute to the polis through scholarship.
Yes.
Well, thank you, Professor, for really bringing to life this period of Roman history.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for watching my interview. If you want to go even deeper into these ideas, then join my email list at greatbooks.io. You'll not only get lectures and interviews, but also transcripts, book summaries, and essays, all to help you explore the most important books in history. Now, if you like this interview, there's 2 more that I filmed with Professor Volk on the ideas and people that shaped the late Roman Republic. One of them is on Stoicism, and the other one is on the intellectual life of Cicero and Caesar. Another direction you could go is to dive into a dramatization of this time period. Shakespeare's Julius Caesar covers the exact events we discussed in this interview. It's one of my favorite plays by the Bard and has shocking relevance to our current political situation. So if that interests you, check out my lecture on Shakespeare's Caesar. You can find links to everything we discussed today in the description, as well as on my website, greatbooks.io. Thank you.